Because if you compare what Hitler writes about in Mein Kampf to what actually takes place, it's almost like he's telling the future. Because what we're going to see is Adolf Hitler starts to implement what he had always planned and written about in Mein Kampf. Today, what we're going to be looking at is we're going to take a look at some of those main pillars that he writes about. Now, first off, when he writes Mein Kampf, he writes about how he envisions a greater Germany, where he wants to bring about the Third Reich, the third great German empire. And when he comes to power, he's going to do something that really does kind of lay the foundation for that. In one of his big presentations, Adolf Hitler is going to tell the German people, the Treaty of Versailles is holding us back. This is the shackles that keeps us down. And he's not wrong, he's right. That was the purpose of the Treaty of Versailles, to make it so Germany could never make war again. Now, there were specific provisions in there that limited Germany's war-making abilities. Remember, they were only allowed to have a 100,000-man army. It's not even enough to protect Germany proper. They had to hand over their navy to the Brits. They weren't allowed to have an air force. And here's Adolf Hitler saying, I will no longer abide by this. In a very symbolic gesture, he takes out the Treaty of Versailles and holds it in front of a crowd and tears it apart and says, we're going to rearm. And he opens up the factories to build military supplies. Now, I want to point something out here. Remember, Germany had, the Great Depression came to them, and they had it probably worse than the United States did. Do you remember? At their peak, what was the German unemployment rate? Yeah, it was about 35%. Adolf Hitler opens up the factories to start building war materials. And they build and build and build. Guess what starts happening to the unemployment rate? It starts to drop. 28%, 25%, 17%. Even people that were not followers of Hitler early on in his political career start looking at this and they say, maybe he is going to pull us out of the Great Depression. Maybe he does have some answers. It's from here where Hitler's going to begin one of the plans he has in Mein Kampf, where he says, there are German people throughout Europe that are stuck, that are trapped in these artificial nations simply created by the victors of World War I. When they wrote out the Treaty of Versailles, they made multiple new nations, and they just simply drew the lines on the map. Adolf Hitler's looking at these new nations, and he says, there are German speakers trapped in these artificial nations. I'm going to unite these German speakers and bring about the Third Reich. The first place he looks is going to be Germany's neighbor. He looks to Austria. Now, probably for several reasons, but one, there are literally millions of German speakers in Austria. Austria and Germany have a very shared kind of culture. Similar language, similar traits. And in fact, Adolf Hitler isn't even German. He's Austrian. He wants to annex Austria into Greater Germany. And he starts spelling out how we're going to unite. You're going to be the first addition to the great German Empire. Austria had economic issues as well, and they look at Adolf Hitler lowering that unemployment rate. And there are lots of people in Austria that start saying, maybe he does have the answers. Maybe, and this is a quote from an Austrian, maybe Adolf Hitler's the greatest leader in the world. When the German army rolls into Austria, They are greeted with celebration. People throw flowers at their feet, and they welcome the Nazis as liberators. Adolf Hitler gobbles up Austria as the troops march in unopposed, welcomed even. Now here's the thing. Is Germany getting stronger? Was the Treaty of Versailles designed to keep them weak? He tears up the Treaty of Versailles. Germany rearms. They're going to annex Austria. Is it time for war? Who wants to stand up to Hitler? Who should? So, like, the League of Nations? We saw what the League of Nations did when China asked for help. Are they going to do anything? What about the Brits? What about the French? Should they stand up to him? There's something that you got to understand, because this is, you can look at it again in hindsight, but there's just, you're not in their shoes. The people who are decision makers at this time are a mere 20 years removed from World War I, from a war that collapsed empires, the war they thought would end all wars. The men who are making decisions at this point were either, one, in the war itself, saw what happened, or two, were low-level decision makers. They see Germany rearming. They see Germany expanding, and they say, we don't want war again. But sooner or later, you gotta do something. Britain and France, watch Germany get stronger. Watch them rearm. Watch them annex Austria. And they do nothing. So if you're Adolf Hitler, are you going to stop with this? He's emboldened. So he looks to his next target, another German neighbor. He looks to Czechoslovakia. Now, Czechoslovakia is one of these new nations created by the Treaty of Versailles. It's drawn up with the fall of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. It's been in existence for roughly 20 years, with the lines, the boundaries drawn by the victors. Adolf Hitler looks at Czechoslovakia and says, there are German speakers trapped in this artificial nation. I'm going to liberate them. I'm going to bring them into the greater Germany. I'm going to make them part of the Third Reich, especially Western Czechoslovakia, called the Sudetenland. Now again, in this instance, Hitler's not wrong. He's right. There are German speakers in Western Czechoslovakia. He can make an argument and say they should be in Germany. So he starts to mass troops along the border, telling the Czechs, you can either hand over the Sudetenland, or I can invade and take it. Choice is yours. Now, let me just kind of throw this out there. He gives that ultimatum to Czechoslovakia. Are the Czechs just going to give in? Are they going to hand over the Sudetenland?
Probably.
Well, let me kind of say it like this. Could Czechoslovakia stand up to a rearmed Germany? Probably not. But are you just going to surrender? The Czechs tell Hitler, we're not giving you what you want. If you want to invade, you're going to have to do that. But there is a piece that complicates this. The Brits and the French have a deal with Czechoslovakia. They have a fairly loose alliance. The Brits and the French are going to tell Hitler, if you invade Czechoslovakia, you might have problems with us. So before we go to war again, before we start another World War I style war, we need to sit down. We need to talk about this. Now, this right here is the British Prime Minister. This is Neville Chamberlain. Chamberlain saw what happened in World War I. Hitler was in World War I. He was in the trenches. They sit down together, and all but immediately, actually, I should probably say it like this. Chamberlain's outmatched, without a doubt. Hitler runs rings around him. Because Hitler sees this as a poker game. He's playing against his opponent. He knows that Chamberlain doesn't want war. So when they sit down together, Hitler tells Chamberlain, look, I was in World War I. I was in the trenches. I promise. I don't want war. I just want to free these German speakers. If you simply give me the Sudetenland, let me have it, and we'll avoid war. And I promise, this is my last territorial demand. I want nothing else after this. If a fascist dictator gives you a promise, don't believe it. He's lying to you. And here's Chamberlain. This is just pathetic. Chamberlain says, well, I want it in writing. I want you to sign on this piece of paper that this is your last territorial demand. And Hitler just said, okay, fine. Give me the paper. I'll sign it. Signs and says, yeah, I promise, my last territorial demand. Here you go. Chamberlain takes that piece of paper, and you can see it because there's video footage of it. He gets on an airplane. He leaves Germany, gets back in England, and he steps out of the airplane, waving this piece of paper. And he says his famous quote, I've preserved peace in our time. Look, Hitler signed this, and he promised. It still boggles the mind. He had a chance to stand up to it, and he failed. He signs off and gives Hitler Western Czechoslovakia. Do you think Hitler's done now? Guess what he does? Nope. He just takes all of Czechoslovakia. He invades and takes it. And Chamberlain says, but he promised he wouldn't do that. He's an absolute fool. Now is it time for war? No. Chamberlain says, I want to avoid war at all costs. All Chamberlain is doing is giving him what he wants in hopes that he goes away. He's appeasing a dictator. Now, another little lesson. If you simply give him what he wants, he's not going away. He's going to take more. But the Brits and the French are terrified of going to war again. In fact, Chamberlain himself says, even if we wanted to go to war now, we couldn't. We're not ready for a war against Germany for 5 more years. Too bad. It's happening. It's coming right now. And if you don't stand up to him now, you're going to have a stronger Germany in the future. What Chamberlain does is an absolute disaster, because now Germany's gobbled up Austria, gobbled up Czechoslovakia, they're still building their military, and now they've got bigger sights. Hitler sets his sights on another German neighbor. Guess where he's going next? Guess it. France? Not France, not yet. Not ready for that. Grant, what do you think?
Hungary.
Actually, he's going to take Hungary a little bit later on. Czechoslovakia, Hungary's going to fall shortly after that. What do you think?
Belgium?
Say it again?
Belgium?
No, it doesn't want to go west.
Poland.
Sets his sights on Poland. Now, we're going to see the same pattern. In Poland, Adolf Hitler says there are German speakers trapped in this artificial nation. Now, Poland is created at the end of World War I. Poland is one of those nations that the victors create, taking lands from Germany to create it and taking lands from Russia. Now, I got to ask, why did they take land away from Russia to make Poland?
So that would be a good competitor against Germany.
Oh, no. Thought I heard it. What was it? Someone said it. They dropped out of the war early. So the victors took a chunk of Western Russia and said,